Coming up on The Daily with me, Niall Paterson. Contrary to expectations, inflation has dropped. So is the Chancellor breathing just a little easier? That's next.
This will truly be the golden age of America.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
If Trump's presidency is anything like last time, we are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
Together we can truly make America great again.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning, trying to make sense of what it all means for the United States and for the rest of the world. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
A week of peaks and troughs for this government. Yesterday, the anti-corruption minister, Tulip Siddiq, resigned, having been accused of corruption. She stepped down, saying she didn't want to be a distraction. And weeks of allegations involving her aunt, the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh, certainly had been. But another, rather more useful distraction has since emerged. Inflation came in at 2.5% for December, slightly lower than forecast. Sir Keir Starmer and his embattled Chancellor Rachel Reeves, well, they were certainly in need of some good news. But is a 0.1% drop enough to silence those calling for her head on a plate? Our business correspondent is Paul Kelso. Oh, look, Paul, clearly, understandably, this is good news for the politicians, of which more in just a second. But what about the punters?
Inflation's the most significant bit of economic data we ever talk about in the real world because it affects the price of everything we buy and has huge knock-ons for the big, chewy macroeconomic stuff. But at micro day-to-day level, the most important thing is prices aren't rising as fast as they were. And that is good news. Prices still going up, but not as fast. It could well have some pretty significant knock-ons into the mortgage market and the cost of borrowing, which affects about a third of people who've got mortgages, but it affects everybody who's borrowing one way and another and those who are renting as well. And things like your phone and your broadband contracts, they're index linked. That means linked to inflation, many of them. So lower inflation numbers, depending on how your contract works and which number is taken to set that rate, that could also be a bit lower the price increase than expected. A lot of inflation essentially for consumers, because inflation means prices are still rising. It often means it could have been worse because it's not quite as bad as it was the previous month and hopefully won't be as bad in future.
OK, so what exactly is going on? Do we know? Because this wasn't forecast, was it?
No, it wasn't. Certainly a fall in inflation, we've gone to 2.5%. The economists' consensus was it would stay at 2.6%, so any decline is welcome. It's largely driven by a couple of things. Hotel and restaurant prices not increasing as fast, and a fall in airfares relatively. So airfares still increasing in price, but not as much as they did in the same month the previous year. That was offset a bit by transport costs. It essentially means petrol prices were going up, but there were some lower price rises in a couple of areas where we typically spend quite a lot of money in December. That's why this number is down.
It's not a phrase that we use quite as often anymore, but we are still in something of a cost of living crisis, aren't we? Those price rises are baked in essence.
They are, and we always stress, inflation means prices are going up, and just because inflation is down, it doesn't mean prices are. So prices are still rising. The Bank of England's target for inflation is 2%, and there's some pointy-headed economic reasons for that, but another one, so that's thought to be about sustainable for an economy in which you'd hope wages were rising similarly. But if we take out the month-on-month numbers and just go back, let's rewind. Imagine we're sitting Christmas or New Year 2022, before the war began and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Compare prices then with today. We're talking about 25% increase in food prices in particular that hasn't gone away. That's a huge increase in our underlying basic costs. So the inflationary impact of the war in particular, because it affected everything, the stuff that really matters, energy prices, food prices, fertiliser prices, without which we don't get the food in the first place in the same numbers, has left behind a higher cost of living that many people are still trying to catch up with.
How are we doing compared to similar economies, Paul?
Today's numbers are bang on the EU average, a little bit below the US, and the US we can expect to probably get a little bit higher. So we've got there. It took a little bit longer for the inflation to start to wash away in the UK, but comparatively we're in line with, most of those economies I've mentioned, certainly Western Europe. And the question for the politicians that will affect all of us is how can we do in future, and what changes might help ease the burden of inflation, get it down to target, and get the economy running so that what we're paid every month covers it.
One of those macroeconomic levers, of course, is not in the hands of the government, but instead in the hands of the Bank of England. Interest rates. I mean, clearly everyone wants them to come down. On the basis of what we have heard today, what's the likelihood?
The likelihood is higher that rates will come down than it was before these numbers were published. And I'll dig just briefly a little into the underlying numbers around this figure. The headline rate's 2.5%, but the Bank of England has been looking at some of the components, and for a long time it's been saying it's wanted to see a couple of the underlying measures of inflation, core inflation, which is a measure of underlying inflation, and that's fallen today more than expected. There's another number that's important here, services inflation. Quite a big chunk come out of that. Services are 80% of the British economy, which is why the Bank of England looks at it. And these are, we can think of those measures as proxies for what it calls, sticky domestic inflation. Inflation peaked because of those external factors caused by the war. How much of that was going to stick to the British economy and become a domestic problem that didn't go away when energy prices fell back? That was the Bank of England's concerns. It said, the governor has said several times recently, he wants to see movement in those core inflation numbers and services inflation. Well, we've now had that movement. When the bank meets, there's 9 members, they vote on it. The last time there was already some appetite to cut. The markets think these numbers are more likely to tip that into a rate cut. So when they sit down on February the 6th and we hear the decision, the markets, which bet on these things, now think there's an 80% likelihood interest rates will be cut by 0.25%, and it was only 60% before the numbers were published. So this is potentially good news for anyone who's borrowing and anyone who is going to be looking at starting or renegotiating a mortgage in the coming months.
Big emphasis, I imagine, though, Paul, in your last answer, on potentially. I mean, is that it for inflation? Are we expecting it now to continue to trickle down towards that Bank of England target, or could there still be some surprises ahead?
Yeah, it's not it by any means. It might not even be it before the next meeting. 2 reasons for that. Let's talk about the domestic ones. Most forecasts have inflation rising again as we get into the spring, above 3%, so going in the wrong direction. And one of the reasons for that, and the most politically challenging reason for that, is that the measures in the budget that the Chancellor announced, and I know we'll come on to that, so when things like tax increases feed in after April, that could push inflation up. And there's another reason to go back to the Bank of England's deliberations that might give them pause even before their meeting. We will have a new president in the United States. You may have heard of him. He's got some, should we call them unorthodox economic plans, tariffs, trade wars, the rest of it, all considered inflationary. And that has more impact, frankly, at the moment on the cost of borrowing than what the Chancellor is doing. So it isn't it for inflation by any means. But there might be a little window here, a sweet spot, where the bank's got an excuse, and indeed they'd never call it an excuse, but a motivation to cut rates that might land before the inflation picture picks up on the other side and they're more minded to hold.
Paul, just take a breather there. When we return, we will move off the economics and onto the politics. What does this mean for Rachel Reeves and her future as Chancellor? Paul Kelso, our business correspondent, is still with me. And Paul, as we were talking about those inflation figures, good news for Rachel Reeves. Remind us why she's in need of good news at the moment, because people are openly speculating about whether or not she will be Chancellor this time next year. What's been going on?
Yeah, it's sort of remarkable that, isn't it? Because her and Keir Starmer joined at the hip. She's been in rehearsal for this job. The audition went on for several years. She's worked at the Bank of England. She is an economist to her bootstraps. And now she's in the job. She is discovering not only is there no magic money tree, there's no magic wand either. The pressure, the pressure is it's a little curious. She's been under pressure by this combination of the pound weakening. So the pound is worth less against the dollar, which is a verdict on the strength of the British economy. economy from the markets, and the cost of borrowing, that's a function of the bond markets. So there has been, while it's, as we've been discussing, it's moved broadly in line, largely these increases in borrowing costs are driven by the US. There's been a little bit of a premium on the UK, but there's been no economic data in the time this pressure has built. Unlike today, there's no interest rates, of course. This is, it's what our colleague Ed Conway called vibes. Now we have the data. That's why it feels like it's bought us some time today. She can talk about international factors and has done, which is why I wouldn't call this an economic crisis, but it is absolutely a real thing she has to deal with, and a big political headache, because the thing she can't escape is responsibility for the budget, which brought in a huge chunk, more than £25 billion of tax rises on business that are about to come in. Every business group, every company owner is telling you that is making them have another look at their plans for investment. That's going to have an impact on growth. So she can't evade responsibility for a budget that is inflationary and ends up suppressing the one thing she needs most of all, which is growth. So that's where the pressure has come from.
Still, and forgive my economic illiteracy on this particular topic, a 0.1% drop in inflation, 0.1%, inflation coming in 0.1% less than expected, doesn't sound an awful lot to me, and yet I can still hear the sound of champagne corks being popped down at the Treasury.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? Because you're right, it's kind of negligible, and we probably wouldn't notice if we were buying the champagne ourselves. Unlikely, though, that might be. But it is, I suppose we're back to vibes here. There's even vibes in the data. It's better than expected. And those underlying numbers we were talking about, they will look at those and think the Bank of England has got space here to do us all a favour, particularly Rachel Reeves a favour, and cut rates. So it is about that expectations, and it does buy her breathing space, and it gives her time to try and do something about confidence in the UK and explain her plan better. And she's going to be busy. She got stick for going to China last week, but she's off on her travels again. Next week she'll be in Davos in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum, which is a talking shop for heads of state and business leaders, an impressive list of folk. Donald Trump will be addressing that virtually, but 50 heads of state, couple of hundred CEOs. She'll be banging the drum for business. She'll be speaking to the media. She'll be making the case for the UK in a big meeting of overseas investors. She'll then come back at the end of the month. We're expecting a speech on her plans for growth. Again, all part of the political messaging to make the case that she has got a plan. Bear with her. And then we'll also hear more of the kind of things we heard the Prime Minister talking about AI earlier in the week. There's an industrial strategy being written. It's got 7 key areas. AI is one of them. We can expect to hear more about life sciences, defence spending, the kind of areas where the UK has got high growth areas where they think if they can encourage inward investment, put some government money in as well via the National Wealth Bank, it can start to deliver the underlying structural changes that the UK needs to deliver growth, supercharge even, in the politicians' words. Problem with all of that is it's long term, medium term at best. So we can see she could really do, when we get the growth figures, and we'll get some this week, she could really do with some growth right away to try and demonstrate that she isn't a massive downer on the economy, which is the fundamental argument against her.
So in short, off to Davos, but not out of the woods. I mean, we've got national insurance rises coming for business very soon. The cost of debt, that's still an issue. I mean, her political future is not yet guaranteed, is it, Paul?
No, it's not guaranteed, although I think Downing Street clarified she'd be in post till the end of this term. I think she needs to make the question go away. That's the issue. Whatever the answer, politics is politics, all sorts of things happen. She needs to make the question go away, and she can do that by a combination of better messaging, some fundamental evidence that the economy is moving in the right direction. If she can make the questions go away, perhaps she can get on with trying to deliver what is a very ambitious programme. Remember, what's at the heart of this? She's trying to repair public services Labour says are broken. She's chosen to do it by a really hefty tax take on business, and she wants to deliver growth. That's where this magic wand would really come in handy.
Yeah, just on growth. I mean, ultimately, if the UK were to grow significantly, we would be bringing ourselves out of this crisis, or at least ameliorating some of the worst effects. So when can we expect to see it, Paul?
Good question. I'll refer you to my honourable friend, the Chancellor. We might see some this week. We've got GDP numbers for November coming out. The consensus, which we know from today isn't always reliable, is for modest, a little blip, 0.2% of growth. But the trend is not good. We were flat in the last 2 months. Third quarter of the year, zero growth. The forecast were there will be about 1.7% of growth this year. That will be on the upside for the UK recently. So it's the trillion-dollar question, because a few percentage points of growth make all these problems go away. Well, the government's focusing on these areas where it thinks it can deliver high-growth industries and encourage them. It's latched onto the energy transition. It's something that's got to happen. It thinks it's got to happen faster than the opposition do, but there's a big industrial transformation there. If you can be at the forefront of creating those jobs, there's a win. But these are big underlying issues that take time to deliver. The short term, and even the window of a parliament, an electoral cycle, 5 years, isn't that long in the scheme of things, particularly if you get bogged down, as this government has in its early days. So I think what they would love is for these questions to go away, to a chance to demonstrate that the plan is working. But the proof will be in the numbers and ultimately in how we all feel about how much money we have in our pockets.
Certainly will be. Paul, many thanks. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We will be back tomorrow, but if you want to find out the very latest on the state of the economy, why would you? Head to skynews.com for the Money blog. We'll catch up again tomorrow.